For 35 years, 5 kids vanished from a rural town in 1989, and Milford learned to live with unanswered questions. 10. In spring 2024, the FBI reopened the case not because of a confession, not because of new witnesses, but because of an unforgotten Polaroid pull from an old evidence file. At first, it looked harmless. Cassie, Tom, Rahel, Danny, and little Ella standing together, smiling like in a normal summer day. But when an investigator enlarged the background, a sharper appeared behind them to define to be a stein, to position to be accidental. A hidden figure, frozen in time, waiting.
The world had long since forgotten the missing children. The 5 of them, lost in a small town in rural America in 1989, had become nothing more than a faint memory, a distant tragedy, slipping quietly into the archives of time. But in 2024, something unexpected happened. The FBI, decades after the case had grown cold, reopened the investigation. It was a decision that would set the country on edge, forcing the nation to reckon with a mystery long buried and an uncomfortable truth that no one had anticipated. It all started with a single photograph, a faded Polaroid, discovered in the most unlikely of places. The photograph was nothing extraordinary at first glance. A group of young children, standing close together, their faces full of innocence, their eyes filled with the simple joy of childhood. But there was something about that image, something that caught the attention of the investigators. A detail so subtle that it eluded every person who had come into contact with the case before. A detail that might hold the key to unraveling a mystery that had haunted the town for over 30 years. The image had been buried in an old file, buried in an evidence room where no one thought to look. The 5 kids, Cassie, Tom, Rachel, Danny, and young little Ella, had gone missing one late summer evening in 1989. They were all between the ages of 7 and 13, their lives just beginning when they vanished from the face of the earth. The small rural town of Milford, nestled quietly between stretches of forest and farmland, was rocked by the disappearance of these children. The town was not prepared for something like this. A place known for its simplicity, where the harshest crime was a stolen bicycle, suddenly found itself in the grip of something unspeakable. In the days after their disappearance, the town searched, relentlessly. Neighbors and friends turned out to comb through the woods, searching every hollow, every abandoned shack, hoping to find any sign of the children. But as the days turned to weeks, then months, the hope began to fade. No one had seen them. No one had heard anything. The silence was deafening. What happened to those children? Where had they gone? The FBI was called in, but their investigation went nowhere. They scoured the area, questioned witnesses, examined old leads, and came up empty-handed. There were no ransom notes, no bodies, no signs of forced entry. Just empty fields and silent roads. The only thing left behind was a ghostly chill that gripped the town, and the unanswered question that haunted every corner. How could 5 children simply vanish? The case remained open, but with each passing year, the trail grew colder. The memories of that summer faded. The families of the missing children never stopped grieving, but life in Milford moved on. New families moved into the town. New stories were written, new friendships formed. The absence of the 5 children lingered like an invisible scar, but eventually, the town healed around it. And yet, for those who remembered, the loss was an open wound, never fully healed, always aching beneath the surface. It was only in the spring of 2024 that something changed. An investigator, going through a pile of old case files, stumbled upon that single photograph. It had been overlooked for years, dismissed as insignificant, but it was now clear that it held a clue, something that had been missed all those years ago. The photograph, slightly yellow with age, seemed to capture a moment frozen in time. But on closer inspection, something in the background caught the investigator's eye. There, just behind the children, was a shadow, a figure indistinct, but undeniably there. It was the kind of thing one might dismiss in a casual glance, but now, in the quiet isolation of a cold, sterile office, it seemed impossible to ignore. Who was that figure? What were they doing there? The photograph was the first spark, the first flicker of something long buried. From that moment on, the investigation took on a new urgency. The FBI agents, who had long since resigned themselves to the fact that this case would never be solved, now found themselves pulled back into a mystery that had refused to die. The once dismissed file became the focal point of renewed energy. The team began to revisit every lead, every witness, every piece of evidence. They interviewed those who had been children at the time, hoping to find something they had missed. They re-examined the town, its history, its secrets. What had Milford been hiding all these years? And why had it been so easy to ignore the disappearances for so long? The families of the missing children, many of whom had never fully recovered from their loss, were contacted once again. Some were hopeful. Some, like Rachel's mother, had lived for decades with nothing but grief and guilt. What had happened to her daughter? Where had she gone? Would she ever get to say goodbye? The emotional pain had never really subsided, just pushed down into the deepest corners of her heart. But the reopening of the case stirred something in her. Was there hope after all these years? Could the truth finally come to light? And yet, there was something else, something darker, something more insidious. As the investigation gained traction, more questions began to arise. What had the children been involved in their final days? Was there something they knew, something they had stumbled upon, that had led to their disappearance? And why, after all these years, was the FBI suddenly so determined to uncover the truth? The more the agents uncovered, the deeper the mystery grew. This was no longer a simple case of missing children. The investigation was uncovering a network of secrets, lies, and buried truths that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The chilling question began to take root. Were the children just victims of a random tragedy? Or was there something far more calculated, far more sinister at play? The photograph, the key to unraveling this mystery, was just a beginning. What the FBI would discover next would leave the country in shock, forcing them to confront not only the fate of these 5 children, but the very fabric of the town that had once seemed so innocently quiet. The hook of the story had been set, but what lay beneath the surface was a dark, twisted tale that no one had been prepared for. And as the investigation unfolded, a realization began to dawn. This case would be much larger than anyone had imagined. The children were gone, but their story was just beginning to be told. In 1989, the small town of Milford, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural America, could have been mistaken for any other quiet, picturesque community. The town was a patchwork of farmland, dense woodlands, and scattered homes, where everyone knew each other's name, and life moved at its own unhurried pace. It was a place where the loudest sound on any given day was the clattering of a neighbor's tractor or the distant hum of a childhood bicycle ride down a dirt road. In a town where nothing ever really changed, everyone felt a sense of peace and security, believing that bad things simply didn't happen here. At the heart of this idyllic town was a group of children, 5 of them, all close in age and bound together by friendship and blood. There was Cassie, the eldest, a 12-year-old with the kind of gentle maturity that made her a natural leader among the group. Then there was Tom, just a year younger, mischievous and full of energy, always coming up with wild ideas and daring stunts. Rachel, sweet and thoughtful, was just 10 but had a quiet strength about her that everyone admired. Danny, barely 8, was a curious one, always asking questions and never seeming satisfied with easy answers. And little Ella, barely 6, a bright-eyed child who still believed the world was full of magic and wonder, the kind of innocent spirit who could make even the most jaded adult smile. The 5 of them spent their days together, creating their own adventures in the woods that bordered the town. They would spend hours climbing trees, playing in abandoned barns, or running through fields, their laughter echoing through the still air. They knew every secret hiding place in Milford, the hollow in the old oak tree, the creek where they used to skip rocks, the barn where they found their first baby birds. It was a childhood steeped in simplicity, where the greatest threat they faced was a scraped knee or a bruised ego after a failed attempt at a tree-climbing contest. The town itself was not just a place to live, but a community where everyone was intertwined. It was a town that came together for everything. Sunday picnics, county fairs, even the harvest festivals. People didn't just live side by side. They watched each other's children grow up, helped each other through the hard seasons, and celebrated the good ones. No one locked their doors at night. It wasn't the kind of town where children were warned to stay away from strangers or told to be cautious. In Milford, everyone was a neighbor and everyone was trusted. For Cassie, Tom, Rachel, Danny, and Ella, there was no fear. The woods were their playground. The fields were their kingdom. There was a certain magic to the air in those days, a feeling that anything was possible, and the world was wide open before them. They didn't know it then, but in a sense, they were living in a bubble, one that would soon burst in the most tragic of ways. On the evening of their disappearance, the day had been like any other. The sun had hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the sleepy town. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sky was a brilliant shade of pink and orange as the sun began its descent behind the distant hills. The children had spent the day exploring, as they often did, but this time something was different. They had been more excited than usual, a sense of urgency in their steps, an electricity in the air. They spoke in hushed tones, as though they were on the cusp of something big. Cassie had mentioned they might go down to the old creek near the edge of town, a place that always seemed to promise adventure, but it had been getting late, and everyone knew they had to be home before dark. The evening curfew was as much a rule of nature as it was a rule of the town, and the parents had long grown accustomed to seeing the children's faces light up with excitement at the promise of another night spent safely at home. But this time, the promise of safety would be shattered. The children had all agreed to head back before the sun dipped too low. It was Rachel who had suggested one last game of hide-and-seek before they called it a day. The others, eager for one final burst of energy, agreed. As always, Ella was the one who would hide first, her tiny form easily slipping into long grasses, her giggles bubbling up from the shadows. The others chased after her, calling her name, their voices growing fainter as they ran farther into the woods. It was here, in the fading light, where the last fragments of their innocence would slip away. By the time the game ended, the children had become aware of something. It wasn't the sounds of crickets or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It wasn't even the low hum of the evening wind. It was the silence. They hadn't heard the faint echo of a neighbor's voice, nor the distant rumble of a car. No one else was out there. The world, once so full of life, now felt empty. It was the kind of unsettling quiet that begins to creep into the air when something is wrong. But they didn't think much of it at first. They were used to the peaceful, almost eerie stillness of the woods at dusk. Cassie, the eldest, was the first to feel it. She stopped in her tracks, her brow furrowing as she looked around. The others, noticing her sudden stillness, followed her gaze. The trees seemed denser now, as though they were closing in on them. The familiar paths they had walked countless times before suddenly seemed unfamiliar, even dangerous. The sun, once golden and warm, had dipped lower, and shadows stretched long across the ground. Tom had joked, attempting to break the tension with a loud, mocking yell, but it fell flat in the air, swallowed by the weight of the evening. Rachel suggested they head back to the road, a sensible idea, but one that felt like an afterthought. Then came the moment that no one would ever be able to explain. A sound, the snap of a twig underfoot, not from behind them, but from ahead. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was deliberate, controlled. The children froze, their breath catching in their throats. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling of the trees, and then they heard it again. The evening had begun like any other in Milford, but as night settled in and the children failed to return home, the sense of unease gradually began to seep into the hearts of the parents. It wasn't like them to stay out past curfew, especially without a word. As the clock ticked on, the reality began to sink in. Something was wrong. At first, it was only a subtle discomfort, a twinge of worry, a whisper of unease that might have been dismissed under ordinary circumstances. But this wasn't ordinary. This was different. Cassie's parents, Tom's, Rachel's, Danny's, and little Ella's all felt the same growing dread, a knot tightening in the pit of their stomachs as the hours passed. The town had always been small enough that you could count on everyone knowing where you were, and yet, as the minutes stretched into an hour and then two, the absence of their children became a silent terror. This wasn't the normal uncertainty of childhood. This wasn't the feeling that a child had simply lost track of time or been distracted by the allure of some new discovery. This felt deeper, darker, as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. By the time the sun had dipped completely below the horizon, the parents gathered at the town square, their faces pale with worry. Milford wasn't a place that required a police force. With the closest sheriff's office 30 miles away, the town relied on local volunteers, men and women who had little experience in serious crime, let alone the disappearance of 5 children. But now, the old adage about small-town life was beginning to shift. The community felt small in a different way, too small for something like this to happen. These were not the sorts of things you read about in newspapers or saw on TV. This kind of horror didn't belong in a town like Milford. The first search efforts were haphazard, born out of panic more than method. Families began to fan out into the fields, calling their children's names, their voices rising in the thickening darkness. The sounds of their shouts echoed off the trees, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on the town like a suffocating fog. No one had the heart to admit it, but everyone felt it, the creeping realization that they might not find the children. Not tonight, and maybe not ever. By the time the sheriff arrived, along with a handful of volunteers, it was well past midnight. The town was thick with a quiet terror, a sense of mounting dread that nothing could shake. The sheriff, a man who had spent his entire life in Milford, had no idea what to make of it. He'd seen minor thefts, the occasional altercation between neighbors, but this was different. The children had vanished into thin air without so much as a whisper. No signs of a struggle. No clues left behind. The search grew more methodical the following morning, though the sense of panic had already taken root. The adults began to suspect the unthinkable. Had the children wandered too far? Had something happened to them in the woods? Something they couldn't explain? The woods were familiar to the children, yes, but what if something had changed? What if something had been waiting for them out there? Something that knew the land better than they did. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch farther than usual, and the landscape felt alien in ways it hadn't the day before. A team of searchers scoured the area, forming grids in the forest, retracing every step the children had made. They combed through the underbrush, examined the creek beds, peered into every hollow tree, and checked every abandoned barn. The children's favorite spots, the ones they had visited countless times, were all empty. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where they had gone or why. All that was left was an eerie silence that hung in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Hours turned into days, and still no one had any answers. Local law enforcement, now joined by state investigators, could only offer hollow reassurances. They promised to keep looking, to keep digging, but the longer the search went on without results, the more the community's hope began to crumble. By the second day, the town had descended into a strange mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The parents had spent the first few hours of the search clinging to the hope that their children were still out there, that maybe they had just gotten lost or found shelter in the woods. But now, as time dragged on, even the most optimistic began to doubt that anything could have happened except the worst. The children's names were on the lips of every resident in Milford, and soon their faces, captured in photos on posters and in newspaper clippings, spread to surrounding towns. The FBI was called in, their arrival bringing both hope and fear. They were experienced, of course, in handling these kinds of cases, but even they couldn't bring any comfort. The leads they followed were all dead ends. There were no sightings, no witnesses, no trace of the children. The FBI, despite their resources, could offer no answers. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months. With every passing day, the town's heartache grew heavier, and the mystery grew more impenetrable. The investigation began to lose momentum as the trail grew colder. The local community, once so tightly knit, started to fragment. Rumors began to swirl. Suspicions whispered in the shadows. Some questioned whether someone in the town had known more than they let on, while others pointed fingers at outsiders. Milford was, after all, a small town, and the idea of a stranger committing such a crime felt unthinkable. But in the absence of concrete evidence, the whispers continued. Meanwhile, the parents of the missing children were left in a state of perpetual limbo. The hours, days, and months dragged on, each moment a new layer of anguish. They clung to the smallest fragments of hope, refusing to let go of the possibility that their children might still be alive. but the weight of the uncertainty began to suffocate them. Every day without answers was another day spent in a waking nightmare. As the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the search for the 5 missing children stalled in a way that felt unnatural. Milford, once a town defined by its simplicity, became a place shrouded in a dark, unspoken sorrow. The children's faces still graced missing person posters in every store window, their names still whispered in hushed tones. But with every passing day, the memories of their laughter, their energy, faded into the background. Life went on, despite the weight of the town's grief. People returned to their routines, the rhythm of daily life resumed. But the absence of those 5 children had left an indelible mark on Milford's soul. The silence was no longer comforting. It was heavy. It pressed down on everyone who had once known them, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had touched them all. In the beginning, the parents had held on to hope. They clung to the belief that their children might be found, perhaps lost, perhaps frightened, but alive somewhere out there. But as the months wore on, that hope began to feel like a cruel illusion. The cold, hard reality of the situation began to take shape in the form of unanswered questions, empty spaces, and the quiet dread that gnawed at them. What could have happened? Where had their children gone? Had they been taken? If so, by whom? These were the questions that the parents and the townspeople wrestled with. But they were questions without answers, and with time, that unanswered silence became its own kind of torment. For the first few months, the FBI's involvement had offered a shred of hope. Their agents were sharp, experienced, and their arrival had brought with it the promise of a resolution, or at least some answers. But as the weeks turned into months, and still no new lead surfaced, that hope began to fade. The FBI, despite their resources and their extensive search efforts, could find nothing. Their involvement had brought little more than the repeated promise that they were doing everything they could, that they would keep looking. But as time went on, the sense of urgency began to wane. The leads dried up, the witnesses proved unreliable, and every piece of evidence was either inconclusive or led to dead ends. It wasn't that the investigation had been abandoned. It was simply that there was nowhere else to go. The FBI's initial optimism, their belief that something could be uncovered, had slowly been replaced by a cold, hard recognition of the case's unnerving complexity. The town had been searched. Every inch of the surrounding woods had been combed. Every abandoned building and shack had been investigated. But nothing had been found. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No clues that could indicate where the children had gone or who might be responsible. The more the agents worked, the more it became apparent. The children had vanished without a trace. They had simply disappeared, and no one could explain how or why. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole, and in the absence of answers, the sense of loss and hopelessness began to feel permanent. The townspeople, once united in their grief, began to feel the strain of the unresolved mystery. The unspoken question hung in the air like an invisible weight. What if the children were never found? What if they were gone forever? The families of the missing children, particularly the parents, felt the sharp edge of that uncertainty every single day. They had lived through the initial shock of the disappearance, the frantic search, and the painful waiting, but now they were living in something far worse, the slow, suffocating agony of not knowing. Some of the parents tried to keep hope alive, clinging to the belief that their children could still be out there, somewhere, hiding or lost. Others began to look for answers in darker places, desperate for anything that could give them some closure. But nothing came. The town, too, began to change. The once tightly knit community began to fragment under the weight of suspicion and fear. There were whispers in the corners of bars and at dinner tables, rumors of strangers in town, of odd behaviors, of things that didn't quite add up. It was the sort of small-town gossip that had always been easy to dismiss, but now, in the wake of the children's disappearance, it took on a different tone. People started to look at one another differently, as if wondering who among them could be hiding something. The grief had become a collective shadow that lingered over every conversation, every glance, every quiet moment. The bond that had once held the town together began to fray at the edges, slowly and imperceptibly, until no one was quite sure who they could trust anymore. For the parents, the daily routine of life became an exercise in emotional survival. Each parent had their own way of coping with the loss, but none of them were truly living anymore. Rachel's mother, for example, spent her days in a fog of numbness, struggling to get out of bed each morning. She didn't cry anymore, though her heart had been broken in ways she couldn't express. Her thoughts were always with Rachel, what had happened to her, where she was, and whether she was still alive. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed still, Rachel's absence would hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The silence in her room was the loudest thing in the world, and her heart ached in ways she couldn't put into words. Danny's father, on the other hand, had grown bitter. He had stopped looking for answers. He had stopped hoping. The pain of his son's disappearance had twisted into anger. At the police, at the FBI, at the whole town for failing to find out what had happened. He couldn't reconcile the fact that his son had simply disappeared. It was an impossibility that he couldn't accept. It gnawed at him every day, wearing down his resolve, until he started to withdraw from the world around him. He rarely spoke to anyone. He didn't go to church anymore. He barely left his house. Every time he looked out his window and saw the quiet streets, every time he heard a child's laughter from a distant yard, it was as if the world was mocking him. Tom's mother became obsessed with the idea that the children had been taken, not by a stranger, but by someone who knew them. She spent months retracing every step the children had taken, every path they had walked, every conversation they had had. There were no answers, only questions that spiraled further and further out of control. Had they been followed? Had someone been watching them? Was there something in their past that had led to this? Every time she met someone's gaze, she wondered if they knew more than they were saying. The idea that one of her neighbors, one of the people she had trusted, could have been involved in her son's disappearance was a thought she couldn't shake. In the midst of all this, the search continued, but it had become a hollow shell of its former self. Every day, the investigators, both local and federal, went through the motions. They searched, they interviewed, they investigated. But nothing new emerged. The case, once the center of the town's attention, gradually faded into the background. The missing children became a haunting memory that was often too painful to discuss. The town, for all its grief, began to move forward, slowly, uneasily, but forward nonetheless. But despite the passage of time, the mystery of what happened to those 5 children never truly went away. It was as if their absence had seeped into the very fabric of the town, leaving behind an invisible scar. Everyone in Milford, whether they admitted it or not, carried the weight of that mystery with them, and it lingered in the background of their lives like a ghost that could never be exorcised. The children were gone, but they were never truly forgotten. Not by the parents, not by the town, and not by anyone who had ever known their names. The years dragged on in Milford, and the unspoken grief that hung over the town settled into something deeper, more permanent. There was no moment of closure, no relief in the unbearable question of what had happened to the 5 children. The wounds left by their disappearance were never fully healed. The parent of the missing children lived in a state of constant limbo, trapped between the cruel hope that their children might someday be found and the growing fear that they would never know the truth. Each day brought with it a new layer of pain, a new reminder of what had been lost. The townspeople had slowly grown used to the silence, to the empty spaces where the children used to play, but the absence of those 5 young lives was always felt. It was an ache that had become a part of Milford's very soul. As the years passed, the parents tried to move on. They had no choice but to. There was no more searching, no more hope of finding answers. The FBI had all but withdrawn, their presence now little more than a distant memory. The case had gone cold. The town had been left to deal with the aftermath on its own, and in many ways, the sense of loss had become a part of the town's identity. No one dared to speak of it directly anymore. The 5 children were always there, in the edges of every conversation, in the faces of every child who passed by, but no one could bring themselves to confront it. They had no answers to give, no comforting words to offer. And so, the mystery of the 5 missing children lived on as an ever-present shadow, a part of the town's history that no one could escape. For the parents, the pain was constant, though it took on different forms over time. Rachel's mother, one so full of hope, had grown weary. She had stopped waiting for the knock on the door, the phone call, the sudden breakthrough that would bring her daughter home. Instead, she spent her days in a kind of numb silence. She kept her daughter's room the same, as though by some miracle Rachel might walk through the door one day. It was a futile hope, but it was all she had left. Her days were filled with small, quiet rituals, looking through old photographs, remembering the sound of Rachel's laughter, the warmth of her embrace. These were the moments that kept her going, but they were bittersweet. They were memories, and memories were all she had now. Danny's mother, too, had retreated into herself, but her grief had twisted into something darker. She could no longer bear to visit the places her son had loved. The old creek where they had spent countless afternoons skipping rocks, the hill where they had once watched the sunset together. These places had become symbols of something cruel, places that served only to remind her the emptiness in her heart. The town had become a place of constant reminders, and so she withdrew, refusing to go out unless she absolutely had to. She worked in the garden, but her hands never really felt the soil anymore. She didn't cry much, not anymore. The tears had dried up long ago, replaced by a hollow ache that never left. It was as though her very soul had been drained of its capacity for emotion. She couldn't even bring herself to talk about Danny. When people asked about him, she would simply smile weakly and change the subject. There was no point in discussing it. There was nothing to say. She had no answers, no closure, just a constant, gnawing emptiness that swallowed everything else. Cassie's father, the most outwardly composed of the parents, had become a shell of the man he once was. He had thrown himself into work, burying his grief beneath a mountain of responsibilities. His business had grown, and he had become a respected figure in the town, but no amount of success could fill the void that Cassie's disappearance had left in his life. Every achievement, every promotion, every moment of success was tainted by the absence of his daughter. The emptiness was always there, a quiet presence that hovered over him, reminding him that no matter how far he ran, he could never escape the truth. His daughter was gone, and there was nothing to do about it. He had learned to keep his emotions in check, to bottle up his feelings until they no longer had any power over him. But in the stillness of the night, when the world was quiet and his mind was alone with its thoughts, the pain would return. It would never truly go away, no matter how hard he tried to push it aside. Tom's mother, however, had taken a different approach. She had become consumed by the desire for answers, no matter the cost. She had spent years trying to find something, anything, that could give her some sense of closure. She had written letters to the FBI. She had tried to track down every lead, no matter how insignificant. She even hired private investigators to comb through the case once more, hoping that someone, anyone, would find a clue that had been missed. But with every new lead that went nowhere, with every promise that turned out to be empty, her desperation only grew. She was convinced that someone in Milford knew something, that someone had seen something, and she would stop at nothing to find out who it was. It was an obsession that alienated her from the rest of the town, from the people who had once been her friends. They didn't understand her need for answers, her relentless pursuit of the truth. To them, it was a closed chapter, a tragedy that had been dealt with in the best way possible, by moving on. But for Tom's mother, moving on was impossible. There could be no peace until she knew what had happened to her son. And yet, despite all their grief, all their searching, the truth remained elusive. The children were still gone. The case was still unsolved. The question still hung in the air, unanswered. What had happened to them? Why had they disappeared? Was it the work of a stranger, or had someone in the town been involved? Had they been taken for a reason? What was the truth? For Milford, the pain of not knowing was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. It was a kind of ache that never truly faded. Every face that passed by reminded them of what was missing, of what had been lost. In 2024, after 35 years of silence, the case that had once captivated Milford and the nation as a whole was suddenly, inexplicably reopened. For decades, the disappearance of 5 children had haunted the town, a scar in the heart community that refused to heal. The town had become used to the quiet whispers, the unsaid truths, and the unspoken grief that lingered like a fog. The parents, still living in the void left by their children, had long given up any hope of closure. They had learned to carry on with their lives, but it was a hollow existence. The loss was like a heavy weight they carried every day, invisible to everyone but them. They had learned to walk through the days in a kind of numbness, trying to find meaning in a world that had been irrevocably changed by the disappearance of their children. The FBI had withdrawn from the case years ago, their involvement reduced to a few pages of cold, unremarkable files in a dusty cabinet. No new leads had emerged. No witness had stepped forward. No evidence had pointed to any clear answers. It was as if the children had vanished into thin air. But now, in the spring of 2024, the case was suddenly being revived. The question that had never been answered, that had festered in the background of Milford's history, was being asked again. What had happened to these children? Why had they disappeared? Was there some hidden truth that had been buried all these years? It all started with a single photograph, a piece of forgotten evidence that had somehow been overlooked for decades, tucked away in the corner of an old, neglected file. The photograph itself was nothing extraordinary at first glance. It was a picture of the 5 children, standing close together, their faces glowing with the innocent joy of childhood. Cassie, Tom, Rachel, Danny, and Ella. They looked like so many children in so many family photos. Carefree, full of life, unaware of the darkness that would soon descend upon them. But there was something in the background of that photograph that caught the attention of a seasoned investigator, a small detail that had been missed all those years ago. A shadow, something that shouldn't have been there. It was subtle, barely visible, but it was enough to make the investigator pause. That moment, when the photograph was first noticed, set off a chain of events that no one in Milford could have predicted. The image, in its faded quality, seemed to hold a secret, one that had been hidden for over 3 decades. The investigator, eager to make sense of it, pulled the photograph from the old file and began to examine it more closely. As he stared at the image, the shadows in the background seemed to take on a life of their own. Was it a figure? Someone standing just out of sight, watching the children? Or was it simply a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the trees, or the children themselves? It was impossible to tell for sure. But the more the investigator studied it, the more the question gnawed at him. If there had been someone in the background of that photo all those years ago, what did it mean? Who were they? And why hadn't anyone noticed before? The discovery of the photograph was the spark that reignited the investigation. The team that had once abandoned the case was now thrust back into a mystery that had lain dormant for so long. The shadow in the photograph became their starting point. And from there, they began to search for anything that might explain its presence. They scoured the old files again, revisiting the witness statements, the records of the search parties, and the reports from the initial investigation. But every lead they followed seemed to hit a dead end. The people who had been closest to the children, their friends, their families, seemed just as baffled as the investigators. No one had ever seen anything suspicious. No one had ever heard anything out of the ordinary. And yet, the children had disappeared without a trace, as though they had been swallowed by the earth itself. The renewed investigation began to peel back layers of the town's history, revealing things that no one had ever considered. For the first time, the people of Milford were forced to confront the possibility that the children's disappearance might not have been an isolated incident. There were whispers, small rumors that had been passed down through the generations about things that had happened in the past. Strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, stories that had never quite added up. The town had always been quiet, yes, but it was also isolated, and there were things that people had kept hidden, things that had been swept under the rug. Could it be that the children's disappearance was part of something larger, something that the town had ignored for years? As the investigation grew, so did the tension within Milford. What had once been a quiet, peaceful town now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. Long-held secrets began to surface, and with them, the uncomfortable reality that Milford was not the idyllic place everyone had thought it to be. There were those who wanted the past to remain buried, who feared what might happen if the truth came out. And then there were those, like the parents of the missing children, who had spent years in torment, desperate for answers, willing to do anything to uncover the truth. The discovery of the photograph became a symbol of everything that had been left unresolved, everything that had been hidden in plain sight. The question of who the figure in the background became a rallying cry for those who were determined to uncover what had happened to the children. It was as if the past, which had been locked away for so long, was finally ready to reveal its secrets. But the truth, when it came, would be far more unsettling than anyone had imagined. The investigation began to take on a new urgency, and the FBI, once reluctant to pursue the case any further, now threw all of its resources into uncovering the truth. The photograph had opened a door, and they had no choice but to walk through it, no matter where it led. The more they looked, the more they uncovered. Connections of people who had once been part of the town, but had since disappeared. Long-forgotten residents whose names had never come up in the original investigation were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. It was as if the case had taken on a life of its own, a life that was slowly but inexorably drawing them closer to something they could no longer ignore. The renewed search was not without its challenges. The town of Milford had changed in the years since the children's disappearance. New families had moved in, new stories had been written, and the memories of those who had once lived there had begun to fade. The people who had been closest to the case were older now. Some had passed away, and others had moved away, unwilling to confront the darkness that had haunted their community for so long. But there were still those who remembered, those who had never forgotten. Some were willing to talk, others remained silent, fearful of what the truth might reveal. As the investigation continued, the story of the 5 missing children began to take on new dimensions. As the investigation into the disappearance of the 5 children entered a new phase, the tension in Milford reached a breaking point. The discovery of old leads and the resurgence of forgotten names began to unravel a narrative that had long been buried beneath the town's serene exterior. What had once seemed like a tragic, isolated event was now being revealed as something much more sinister. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered over the years, began to fit together in a way that made the truth almost unbearable to contemplate. The investigation had dug up a multitude of buried secrets, each more unsettling than the last. The shadowy figures that had once moved in and out of Milford, leaving only traces of their presence, were beginning to take on a more menacing significance. The resurfacing of Ethan Wells, the drifter who had come and gone without ever fully integrating into the town, was only the beginning. As the investigation continued, investigators discovered a network of individuals who, while not directly involved in the children's disappearance, had some kind of connection to a much larger, more dangerous operation. Wells was not just a wandering drifter. He was part of something much darker, a link and chain that stretched far beyond the small town of Milford. Wells's connections were traced to a series of underground groups that operated outside the law. Individuals who trafficked in secrets and had been known to prey on vulnerable communities. These groups, which had operated in the shadows of small towns across the country, were involved in everything from organized crime to human trafficking. The FBI uncovered documents linking Wells to these groups, indicating that his role in Milford might not have been as random as it first seemed. He had been an outsider, yes, but he had been deliberately placed in the town, perhaps to observe, perhaps to manipulate events, or perhaps to lay the groundwork for something far more horrifying. The more the investigators uncovered, the more it became apparent that the children's disappearance might have been part of a much larger, coordinated effort, a dark network that used small towns like Milford to carry out their work undetected. But the connection between Wells and these underground groups wasn't the only shocking revelation. Lena Cross, the former schoolteacher who had left town so suddenly after the children's disappearance, was also found to have ties to these same groups. Cross had appeared to be a pillar of the community, someone who had been trusted by both students and parents alike. Yet, as the investigation delved deeper into her past, it became clear that her departure from Milford was not as innocent as it had seemed. Cross had been involved in a series of covert activities during her time in town, including forming relationships with certain individuals who were known to be affiliated with criminal organizations. She had acted as a conduit, providing information to the groups that had been operating under the radar of the authorities. Her knowledge of the town, its people, and its children had made her an ideal candidate to act as a silent accomplice in a much larger scheme. The connections between Wells and Cross were damning, but they only scratched the surface of a far more disturbing truth. The town of Milford, it seemed, had been a hub for a larger network of criminals who had been operating for years, using the town's isolation and its seemingly peaceful facade as cover for their illicit activities. This network wasn't just involved in the disappearance of the children. It was connected to a broader pattern of strange, unexplained events in other small towns across the country. People had disappeared in these towns, too, and while the circumstances were often different, there were enough similarities to suggest a disturbing pattern. The missing children were merely one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that, when fully pieced together, would reveal a chilling conspiracy that stretched across the country. As the investigation uncovered more and more links between Milford and the larger criminal network, the residents of the town began to react. The fear that had been simmering under the surface of everyday life erupted in full force. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon no one knew whom they could trust. The shadow of conspiracy hung over every conversation, every glance exchanged in hushed tones. The discovery that their town had been a part of something so dark, so unimaginable, was enough to fracture community in ways that no one had anticipated. It was as though the very foundation of Milford had been cracked open, revealing something so ugly and dangerous that it was hard to comprehend. For the parents of the missing children, the revelations were both a curse and a blessing. On the one hand, they were finally beginning to understand what had happened to their children, that their disappearance had not been a random event, but part of a larger, more horrific scheme. But with this knowledge came an even greater horror, the realization that their children had been targeted, not because of who they were, but because of the larger, darker forces at play in the world. The horror of their disappearance was no longer just personal. It was part of something far bigger, something far more insidious. And yet, despite all the pain and suffering, there was a small flicker of hope. For the first time in over 3 decades, the truth was starting to emerge. The question that had plagued the parents for years, what had happened to their children, was finally being answered, even if the answer was far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. As the investigation continued to reveal the true extent of the conspiracy, the authorities began to understand the full scope of what had been happening in Milford. The underground network that had operated in the town was far more organized than anyone had realized, and it spread its influence to other towns in ways that were almost impossible to trace. These networks had preyed on vulnerable communities, using their isolation and trust in one another to carry out their illegal activities without attracting attention. The investigation, now reaching its most critical phase, had turned Milford into a focal point of national attention. The once quiet town, known for its slow-paced life and its tight-knit community, had become a symbol of something far more sinister, a place where hidden horrors had festered beneath the surface for decades. What had seemed like a case of missing children in a small, rural town was now revealed to be part of a much larger conspiracy, one that spanned across the country and touched untold numbers of families. The revelation was nothing short of earth-shattering. Milford, which had once been a refuge from the outside world, was now a place where those dark truths could no longer be ignored. As the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place, the authorities began to uncover the true scale of what had been happening in Milford, and it was nothing short of horrifying. The underground network that had been operating in the town for years wasn't just responsible for the disappearance of the 5 children. It was involved in a sprawling nationwide scheme that involved kidnapping, trafficking, and exploitation on a scale that no one had previously imagined. The children had been stolen, not for random reasons, but as part of a deeply disturbing trade that involved wealthy individuals, criminals, and powerful organizations all working in the shadows. The more the investigators uncovered, the more it became apparent that Milford had been a pawn in this massive operation, a town that had been exploited for decades to facilitate this twisted system. The children's disappearance was just one of many incidents tied to the network. As the FBI worked its way through the evidence, they discovered similar disappearances in other towns across the country, each one eerily similar in its execution. Children had been abducted under the cover of night, without any witnesses, and were never seen again. In each case, the authorities have been quick to dismiss the disappearances as isolated events or simple runaways. But now, with the new evidence in hand, it was clear that these were far from isolated incidents. The pattern was too consistent, the circumstances too alike, to ignore any longer. The investigation revealed that the individuals behind the operation were experts at remaining under the radar. They operated in a way that ensured their actions went unnoticed by local law enforcement, using tactics that allowed them to blend into small towns like Milford without attracting attention. The network's members had infiltrated towns, posing as ordinary citizens, teachers, travelers, and drifters. They had gained the trust of communities they infiltrated, becoming a part of the fabric of life in these towns, only to exploit that trust for their own dark purposes. These people weren't just criminals. They were manipulators, masterfully weaving themselves into the towns they preyed upon. For years, Milford had been a perfect target. Its isolation made it an ideal place for the network to operate without the scrutiny of the outside world. The people of Milford, for all their kindness and warmth, had been too trusting, too unwilling to question the newcomers who arrived in their midst. And, perhaps most disturbingly, the authorities had been equally blind to the danger lurking just beneath the surface. The disappearance of the 5 children in 1989 had been the beginning of a pattern that had played out repeatedly, though no one had connected the dots until now. The network had been systematic, careful in its planning, and ruthless in its execution. Each disappearance was calculated, each child chosen for a specific, sinister purpose. As the investigation dug deeper, the authorities began to uncover names. These were names of people who had operated in the shadows, people who had been connected to the disappearances in ways that defied explanation. Some had been living in Milford for years, while others had passed through briefly, leaving behind only vague traces of their existence. One such individual was Victor Calloway, a name that had been linked to several other missing persons cases in the Midwest. Calloway had lived in Milford for nearly a year during the late 1980s, working as a mechanic in a small garage on the outskirts of town. He had been well-liked by the locals, his rough exterior softened by his quiet demeanor and helpful nature. But beneath this facade, Calloway had been involved in the network, one of its most trusted operatives. He had been the one to establish contact with Lena Cross, the town schoolteacher, and Ethan Wells, the drifter who had come and gone. Together, they had played key roles in orchestrating the children's abduction. Calloway's role was pivotal, and it was now clear that he had used his position in the community to scout potential targets for the network. His garage had become a meeting place, a way station for those involved in the operation. He had been a conduit, feeding information about the town's children to the larger network, identifying which families were vulnerable and which children were most likely to be taken without raising suspicion. As the investigation into the disappearance of the 5 children in Milford reached its final stages, the enormity of what had been uncovered began to settle over the town like a heavy, suffocating fog. What had once seemed like an isolated tragedy, a singular event that had left the town grappling with unanswered questions for over 3 decades, was now revealed to be part of something far darker and far-reaching than anyone had ever imagined. The network of criminals that had operated in the shadows of Milford and across countless other small towns in the United States had been meticulously orchestrating their operations for years, and the 5 missing children had merely been a small part of their chilling, systematic plan. The parents of the missing children, after decades of anguish, were finally beginning to piece together the story of what had happened to their children. The knowledge that their beloved sons and daughters had not simply vanished into thin air, but had been targeted by a group of predators who had exploited the trust of their tight-knit community, left them with a mixture of disbelief, rage, and grief. For years, they had lived with the agony of not knowing what had happened, clinging to the faint hope that their children were still alive somewhere, hidden away from them. But now, as the full scale of the conspiracy came to light, that hope was shattered. The realization that their children had been stolen for purposes too vile to comprehend was a weight that they could hardly bear. It was a cruelty that no parent should ever have to face. In the months that followed the reopening of the case, Milford was torn apart by the truth. The town, once known for its quiet charm and idyllic streets, had now become synonymous with a horrific chapter in American history. The people who had once lived in peace, unburdened by the dark forces that had been working beneath the surface, were now forced to confront the harsh reality of what had been happening in their own backyard. The townspeople had trusted their neighbors, had believed in the sanctity of their community, but they now realized that they had been living among individuals who had been complicit in these crimes, knowingly or unknowingly. The authorities, now fully aware of the scale of the operation, began the painstaking task of tracking down the people responsible. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the network, following the breadcrumbs that had been left behind over the years. Each new lead brought them closer to the heart of the criminal enterprise, and the further they delved, the more complex and terrifying the web of connections became. The individuals who had orchestrated the abductions were not just criminals with a taste for violence. They were cold, calculating masterminds who had created an underground system of trafficking that spanned across the country. They had managed to manipulate the most vulnerable members of society, using small towns like Milford as breeding grounds for their operation. The more the authorities uncovered, the more horrifying the reality became. The network had been involved in a variety of illegal activities, from human trafficking to black market adoption rings, to the exploitation of children in ways that were beyond comprehension. It was a highly organized, efficient operation, with members positioned in key areas across the nation. These were people who had carefully infiltrated communities, gaining the trust of unsuspecting locals, and building networks of influence that allowed them to carry out their plans with impunity. They had used towns like Milford as staging grounds, quietly selecting their victims, grooming them for a life of exploitation, all while blending in seamlessly with the population. For the parents of the 5 children, the search for answers had brought them face to face with their worst fears. But it was not just a revelation of the truth that devastated them. It was a realization that their children's fate had been sealed from the very moment they had been targeted by the network. The children had been chosen not for any personal reason, but because they fit a specific profile: vulnerable, isolated, and easily overlooked. These children, in the eyes of the network, were expendable, mere tools in a much larger, far more sinister game. The community of Milford, having been blindsided by the truth, was now reeling from the aftermath. Many of the townspeople were too ashamed, too broken, to speak of what had happened. Some had been unknowingly complicit in the network's operations, turning a blind eye to the strange disappearances and unsettling events that had occurred over the years. Others had been too trusting, believing that their small town, their peaceful life, would always be untouched by the horrors of the world. But now, as the truth became undeniable, they had to live with the knowledge that their community had been a haven for the very people responsible for these heinous crimes. Some residents tried to cling to the belief that they had not known, that they had not seen the signs, that they were not responsible. But the truth was far more complicated. Many had overlooked the little things, the strange faces that came and went, the whispered rumors of visitors who never quite belonged, the odd coincidences that never seemed to add up. In hindsight, it seemed so obvious, but at the time, no one had connected the dots, and the network had thrived because of this collective blindness. In many ways, the residents of Milford had been unwitting accomplices, their innocence and trust exploited by the very people who had taken the children and used them for their own gain. The town's reckoning was slow, painful, and drawn out. The sense of loss that had hung over Milford for so long had been compounded by the guilt and shame of knowing that the town had unknowingly harbored such darkness. There were no easy answers, no simple way to move on from what had been uncovered. For many, the scars would never heal. The children were gone, but their legacy, the truth of what had happened to them, would forever change the course of Milford's history. The town would always be defined by what had happened, and no amount of time could erase the collective trauma that had been inflicted. Yet, in the wake of the devastating revelations, there was a glimmer of hope. The authorities, now fully mobilized, began to dismantle the network that had used Milford as a backdrop for their monstrous operation. Key figures were arrested, their identities revealed to the public in shocking detail. The public outcry was immense, as the nation's sense of justice was roused by the horrors that had been uncovered. The FBI's relentless pursuit of the individuals responsible for the trafficking operation led to a series of arrests and the unraveling of the larger syndicate. Piece by piece, the faces of those who had been complicit were exposed, and their connections to powerful figures in society were brought to light. For the parent of the 5 children, though, the battle was not over. The pain of losing their children was compounded by the knowledge that their children had been stolen and exploited by those who operated without mercy. The emotional toll was immeasurable. No amount of justice could undo what had been done, and no closure could ever truly heal the wounds of losing a child in such a cruel, calculated manner. But as the authorities closed in on the final pieces of the puzzle, the parents found solace in knowing that the truth had been brought to light. It wasn't a perfect resolution, nor was it a cure for their grief, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward a future where such horrors would not go unnoticed. Milford, however, would never be the same. The scars left by the abductions, the trafficking, and the widespread deception would remain deeply etched into the town's collective memory. What had once been a place of peace, a place where the community had trusted each other implicitly, was now a town forever marked by the darkness that had existed beneath the surface. Milford would never again be the idyllic, quiet place it had once been. It would forever be remembered for the tragedy of its missing children and for the painful, difficult journey toward uncovering the truth that had been hidden for far too long. And yet, amid the devastation, there was a hope that perhaps this revelation would spark change, not just for Milford, but for the entire nation. A hope that, in confronting the darkness, there might be a future where such atrocities could no longer hide in the shadows. The town of Milford had been the site of a tragedy, but it had also become the site of an awakening, a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth pursuing. Even when it seemed too dark to face, even when the cost of uncovering it felt too high, the truth had the power to bring justice, to heal, and to ensure that such horrors would never again be allowed to flourish unchecked.